All right. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for being here. It's an honor to spend the evening together. My name is Jenna Moe. I am the Senior Director of the Society of Fellows, and I appreciate you all taking the time to join us in the auditorium and learn together. I'd also like to thank Bonnie and Tom McCloskey for their generosity and leadership in underwriting the McCloskey Speaker Series, which we present and guest. It's a delight to work in partnership with Aspen Community Programs and Crystal Logan and her fabulous team to present the public lectures with receptions for members of the Society of Fellows. If you're not familiar with the Society of Fellows, we're a membership group of the Institute as a whole, and we work to drive change through leadership and dialogue and support all of the work of the Aspen Institute to create a more free, just, and equitable society. So tonight, we're learning about Strongmen, Mussolini to the present. The talk will be moderated by the wonderful Carolyne Heldman, producer and host of the podcast Behind the Lens. And we're delighted to be joined by our featured speaker, Dr. Ruth Ben-Ghiat. And Dr. Ruth is a professor of history and Italian studies at New York University, and there will be a book signing after the event. Please join us in the lobby. Thank you all for being here. Thank you.
Thank you, Jenna. I want to start because Aspen is a dog-friendly town. You have to see what my dog did to this book. She was very activated by the idea of strongmen, and we've had some funny interactions about that in preparing for this conversation tonight. So I dedicate this to Betty. So thank you for being here. We had a little bit of a trauma on the way here. Dr. Ben-Ghiat lost her laptop on a plane, and it still hasn't shown up. So she's a little, as you can imagine, she's a little unsettled. So we're going to hope for the return of the laptop.
But did not need it for this event. So
don't need
all
it
is
for this
well.
event, yes. The book is a sort of a blueprint, and you walk through it really very brilliantly, as the title describes, from Mussolini to the present. Can you talk about the ways that, or the conditions that lead to the rise? What makes the environment ripe for the rise of a strongman?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so when you write a book that goes over 100 years, you kind of see patterns. And some patterns I expected to see, others surprised me. And so one of the main conditions is when a society has gone through a lot of change that's viewed positively by some and as wrenching and as a loss by others. So it could be periods of great forward strides for workers' rights or women's rights, things like racial emancipation. So a feeling that is born in some that they are losing out from this change in society. And that is when you have almost like a meeting of circumstance and personality. These people come up onto the scene, these kind of charismatic demagogues, and they say they're going to turn the clock back, maybe not so explicitly. And that appeals to people who felt threatened by this change. And so they channel nostalgia very effectively. So when I look around the world and look around history, you see that most of the autocrats, I'll just mention those who are living, they project themselves into the future, but they also channel nostalgia. So Erdogan in Turkey, it's all about the Ottoman Empire. Putin talks about the Russian Empire. Mussolini, back when he started all this, he was going to make the trains run on time. He was going to modernize Italy, but he had the Roman Empire. He actually had the biggest, most stable history, to sediment to draw on. And so in our country, Donald Trump, it's not make the nation great, which he was going to do. It's make the nation great again. And that, again, does the work of the nostalgia. And it's very, very convincing to people.
You also write in the book about utopia, nostalgia, and crisis. Can you go into all of those each?
Yeah. So it's very interesting that these strongmen, they read the moment and they make themselves the bearers of what a nation lacks at that time. They're very good orators, most of them. Some of them are very good sloganeers. Many of them, I discovered, had a past in mass communications. Mussolini and Mobutu were journalists. Some were in entertainment, like Berlusconi. And so they will be whoever their base needs them to be at that moment. They also tend to be very transactional. So like Mussolini would say one thing in the morning to people and the opposite thing to other people in the afternoon. And that kind of contradiction is part of their charm. That's, again, the utopian nostalgia. There are all these like dualities, right? So they will, if, for example, in Italy, there was a feeling that Italy was backwards and it wasn't respected. So Mussolini said, I am going to totally transform Italy. I'm going to make the trains run on time. I'm going to make you respected in the world. So whatever the problem is that's afflicting people, or Hitler, he said, it was the Depression. Germany has been stabbed in the back. Germany is a pariah because the Versailles Treaty made Germany, culpable for everything. I'm going to restore German pride. And in his case, there was the call to tradition. The utopia was a racial utopia. He was going to engineer the master race. So, and you can probably think of other examples around the world, but this dynamic of utopia and nostalgia is very important to the appeal, and it's also how they get so many different types of people to vote for them. So they have these very eclectic constituencies of housewives and gangsters and business elites and thugs and all kinds of people, and they are the glue. So it repeats itself over and over again. It's very interesting.
What are the ways that strongmen use the business community, and you're alluding to it a little bit right now, the ways in which they leverage that, overpromise things, and then when they don't fulfill those, what happens?
Yeah. So one of the concepts I work with in the book is the idea of the authoritarian bargain. And a lot of political scientists and economists use this concept, where it can be when they are coming to power, depends how they're getting to power, and they strike a kind of accord or a deal with elites. It can be religious elites, it can be financial elites, business elites. And they sign on, and they are guaranteed certain privileges or profits. They can cash out. If privatization is on the agenda, they can cash out. In return, they give a kind of unconditional support, and they put up with increasing corruption, and they have to put up with violence. They tolerate violence. They don't speak out about it. Once these bargains are made, they're incredibly durable. Now, sometimes in a true regime, it's because it's very dangerous to defect, very dangerous. You get sent to prison or not. But even where that's not the case, these bargains are very durable until often it doesn't end well. And so for the business community, there have been cases where, again, a lot of, like Pinochet's Chile, there were incredible, it became a test case for neoliberal economics. So some people cashed out a lot from privatizations. But often autocrats, and this isn't known enough, they go after businessmen. They plunder the economy. And we don't hear about that enough. So Erdogan in Turkey, after the coup attempt against him, the business community was one of the biggest targets. And what they do is they seize your assets. They go after your company. Or if you're not being loyal enough, they trump up a kind of, there's something wrong with your tax filing. Or there's something wrong with some other aspect, technical aspect, and they go after you. They sue you. And so business is quite afflicted in regimes. And one of the biggest cases is Putin, who has gone after, if you have a profitable business, Putin will go after you because that's a kleptocracy. That's an extreme case. And so what it does, it's very devastating because it creates conditions of brain drains, talent drains. So in Erdogan, Turkey, many entrepreneurs have had to go abroad, certainly in Russia. So all the qualities that we think in terms of prosperity, that we think about entrepreneurship and leadership, they backfire because the autocrat demands total loyalty, and sooner or later, if he's plundering the economy because his corruption is draining resources, he will come after you. And that is a lesson that is what breaks the authoritarian bargain when they have to go abroad or they end up in jail. It's very sad.
You mentioned that they perhaps even encourage violence, or at least they don't speak out against it. I would imagine that's because that adds to the sense of crisis. Mm-hmm. And so that being an opportune moment that I alone can fix it, or I'm the one who can save the country.
Yeah, one of the saddest things, I try and take the big picture and, perspective. One of the saddest things is that people sign on, and it's very rare that autocrats become more moderate. I actually don't know of any who've become more moderate. It's something to do with the dysfunctional nature of their power. As they consolidate power, they become more paranoid. They need more loyalists around them. They X out anybody who's not a sycophant, and this is called, in my book, the inner sanctum. They create an inner sanctum of cronies, of family members, very common, sons-in-law. I have a whole paragraph about sons-in-law, because those are people you trust, and you can actually treat them as badly as you want, and they can be in on your corruption in some cases. So this leads these leaders over time to start believing in their own propaganda. They make bad decisions, and this often begins their downfall, or it challenges things. And then they have to respond with more propaganda and more repression. So political scientists in particular, they kind of study how these people dose out the loyalty quotients, the propaganda, the repression. But the end is that authoritarian governance, one of the biggest myths I wanted to just debunk, is that it's efficient. Behind the scenes, it is a chaos, a constant hiring and firing, constant draining of resources from corruption and violence. Repression is very expensive. Constant loss of income and talent from brain drains. And so this is what happens when you have this kind of structures of government that autocrats almost inevitably get to.
Can you talk about what your research led you to find globally? What percentage of the population is susceptible to the appeal of this kind of leadership?
Yeah, that's such a good question. It's really interesting. The research shows that, and this is research that's done comparatively, about 30% of a population at any one time has authoritarian leanings.
And this is globally?
Globally. Mm-hmm. Now, in circumstances of, let's say, in a democracy, those authoritarian leanings are expressed through things that are more about private or social life. The way you feel about child rearing, the way you feel about authority, about education, about those things. But when a kind of demagogue comes on the scene and starts denigrating democracy, starts systematically delegitimizing democracy, as Hitler did, as Mussolini did, then that authoritarian inclination can get activated. And if that demagogue reaches out to extremists or allies with extremists to get to power, there are many examples in the world today of that happening, then those people find a home. They find a home politically, and their authoritarian leanings become rewarded, and they actually become norms of the state. They become political norms. So intolerance, refusal for our country. So that was a leap. During that time, same-sex marriage was legalized. That was a leap. Women were admitted to combat. even special forces. That was a leap. People didn't like that. And many other things came during that time. And also, but what we haven't talked about yet has nothing to do with the strongmen. It's about how people become disaffected with democracy. And democracy is not doing a good enough job of, because it's tempting to blame the strongmen for everything, but that's not, that wouldn't be analytical. Democracies sometimes can seem to be failing people. Democratic leaders can seem to be failing people. And so you have widespread loneliness. There are a lot of really interesting books about this. You have people who feel that inequality has gotten to a phase under neoliberal economics, under democracy, so they don't feel there's any hope.
Loss of faith in all the institutions.
Yeah, yeah. So that can already be going on, and some of that was going on around 2016. So we were well placed. Now, because I've studied these people for a very long time, when I saw Trump, who's a superb messenger, a superb performer, he had those traits of reading the audience. And just like Berlusconi, I lived in Italy when Berlusconi came in, and I learned a lot from that. How he brought the fascists into power for the first time since 1945. He read the political marketplace. He saw what was missing, and he went in. And that's what Trump did. And indeed, the Democrats were not appealing to working class and rural voters. And he said, "You are the forgotten people, and I love you, and you will be forgotten no longer." That was very compelling. That was very compelling back in 2016. So I saw him, and then, of course, when he said I could stand on Fifth Avenue and shoot someone, and I wouldn't lose any followers, I was in Washington Square Park in Manhattan, and I ran home to do an op-ed, because this was fundamental, because it was not only associating himself with violence, but saying he would be loved for the violence. I wouldn't lose any followers. And if you've studied fascism and authoritarianism, that is very important. So I was writing about him very, very early. In fact, I wrote a piece in January 2016 saying that if Trump got the nomination for the election, that he would have a personality cult. And no one would take this piece. They thought this was crazy. It was too early. And so I opened a blog at Huffington Post, and I published it there. And I talked about personality cults with Putin and with Berlusconi, and I said he has all the attributes to have a very powerful personality cult that draws people in. So it's funny to go back and look at those early moments to reconstruct how did this start? What was missing in society? What needs were there that were not being fulfilled, either from the Republican Party or from the Democratic Party? And it's worth doing.
I want to come back to the present in a minute, but I'd like you to walk us through Italy, the through line from Mussolini to Berlusconi to Meloni, and vis-a-vis Hitler, and what happened after Hitler in Germany, how Italy is so different. And then let's talk about the United States.
Is that all?
Yeah. Go.
And you have 1 minute.
No, you have 20.
So there are very good reasons. We always hear about Hitler. I don't need to tell you what they are. But Mussolini is actually more relevant to understanding how autocracy takes hold today. Not always. There's lots of coups where it's instant. But Mussolini, he got power very quickly, incredible. And he and Hitler were formed by World War I and the kind of total disruption of everything and crisis after World War I. And he started fascism as a decentralized militia movement. It's very important. It was a militia movement. And it conquered power locally. Like, actually, Steve Bannon is a big fan of Mussolini. He was influenced by the way fascism started to have his precinct strategy. that you conquer locally, the town halls, the this and that. But he did that in 1919. By 1922, he was already prime minister. So Hitler worshipped Mussolini, and his beer hall putsch that failed was an attempt to copy the March on Rome, which was successful, of Mussolini in 1922. And Hitler had this huge crush on Mussolini, and he was constantly writing him, trying to get his autograph, and Mussolini was like, I'm not giving, who is this? And then Hitler went to jail, and Mussolini's like, I'm not going to be writing to a convict. And so Hitler increased his, he had a bust of Mussolini on his desk in the late 20s, and other Nazis made fun of him, but he kept on. And this was because, as you know, Hitler was trying to get into power for a very long time, whereas Mussolini, and he was the one who wrote the playbook. So Mussolini created the first right-wing dictatorship because he was going to be prosecuted. He had been outed in a murder of the socialist leader, and his hands were all over the crime. And a special investigator was appointed, and he was being asked to resign, or the papers and the journalists and the opposition wanted him to resign. And so he was going to go to jail. So what did he do? He declared dictatorship. Wouldn't you do that? And so he passed these laws, which I've been going back to look at, that are called the Laws for the Defense of the State. And in those laws is the playbook. So he wrecked democracy from within. Then he did something very contemporary, which was strongmen will do anything to escape prosecution. In his case, he declared dictatorship. But those laws, they called for things that have been done since by Erdogan, by Orban, and they're also in Project 2025, where you fire all unloyal civil servants. You staff the civil service with people who will be loyal to you, with ideologues, right? That was very important, because it's no good having a regime or a coup or anything if people will not work for to write your laws and be the bureaucrats. And he also expanded executive power. And he had many ways that he made it so that executive decrees could not be opposed by Parliament. So by 1926, he had no checks on his rule. And the other thing I'll mention, because then it connects to Berlusconi, this was in the late 1920s, he was a huge adherent of great replacement theory. The idea that non-white people were going to come in and they were procreating so fast that they were going to extinguish the white race. He wrote many things, this is in my book, and he said that, this is his quote, black, brown, and yellow people are having so many babies that the white race will be submerged. So Hitler learned from him as well. So he's very, very important for understanding the far right today, and he just doesn't get noticed enough. So Berlusconi came in at a period of crisis, right after the fall of communism, and then there was a corruption scandal, and all of the major parties of Italy disappeared. This is the early 90s. So he read the political marketplace, and he created something new. He was a billionaire. He was a sports team owner. He owned all the private networks in Italy. Imagine that. So he was the first person since Mussolini to have that much control of the media. Now, this was the new, you don't need direct old school dictatorship control anymore. If you either own the networks yourself or you get a crony you put them in the hands of cronies. So he was able to do all of that. And the main thing he did, which affects us today, all over Europe too, he brought fascists into the government for the first time since 1945. He brought neo-fascists, and he made them part of his governing coalition. So, and then he rehabilitated Mussolini, and he said famously, Mussolini never killed anyone, in an interview with Boris Johnson, who was then a journalist. So there's that lineage. And in the last Berlusconi government, he also was a partner of Putin. Berlusconi was the person who made himself the mouthpiece of Putin in Europe. So he backed everything Putin did. He sanitized everything Putin did. He sold Putin to European allies. And he tried to sell Putin to America, but it didn't work. And during his last government, his Minister of Youth was Giorgia Meloni. And Giorgia Meloni came up as a hardcore neo-fascist. So I like to say that Giorgia Meloni has a connection to both Mussolini and to Berlusconi. And so she is a superb communicator. People should not underestimate her. She's very effective. Sometimes she reminds me of Mussolini in her way, her oratory, and the way she looks at the crowd. She's very skilled. And she's been playing a double game because she's been very pro-democratic in her foreign policy. She supports Ukraine. At home, not at all. Not at all like that. Anti-LGBTQ, anti-immigrant, suing today's autocrats. If you have a dissident or a critic, you sue them. That's how you financially and psychologically exhaust people. So she's suing people. She's suing a classicist who's been long retired, and he's in his 80s, because he called her a neo-Nazi like many years ago, but he's being sued now. So we can't really understand the right today without this lineage of Italy, but people don't pay attention to Italy. And I started out as an Italian historian, so perhaps I'm biased, but I've been able to do this work because I understood how this functions, and how it can pass in history and be reinvigorated in different eras of history up to today.
Tell us about Germany after Hitler, how they inoculated themselves or prevented this same situation there that happened in Italy.
Yeah, it's a very interesting contrast because the Allies, some of it has to do with the stance the Allies took. The Allies, of course, because of the Holocaust. Now, Italy was a partner in the Holocaust, but the Allies, because of the Cold War, it's a little complicated. Italy had the largest communist party in post-war Europe, and the Allies did not want to alienate Italians overly. So they decided to follow a line that said that the Italians were good people led by a bad man. The bad man was gone, as you know, he was killed, so he was no longer there. So they did not have an equivalent of denazification. So they took a very different stance in Germany. And if you've seen some of you might want to go and see some of the United States documentaries that talk about all Germans as still Nazis. So they had denazification. And that meant in Italy, the fascists went underground. And they literally, instead of destroying the fascist monuments, like they were murals, they literally just covered them up. And there they remained. And so today, Meloni has crowds of people giving fascist salutes because it was never really, they never really got rid of it. It was like, Germany was a very different story, very, very different story. And it's only now that the far right is reinvigorated, and people are doing Hitler salutes again openly. It's taken a long time for this to come about.
Let's come back home. I think a lot of people at first glance feel that the United States is not susceptible to, because coalition government doesn't exist here, we have two-party rule, so we are safe from this type of authoritarian rise, ish. What happens, though, in a two-party system when the entire party is subsumed by one man, or really somewhat unrecognizable from what it was 20 years ago?
Yeah, it's very sad. And it's true that our bipartisan structure was thought to be a great source of stability. And Americans would look at other countries with so many parties, and in Italy and other places you could make, if let's say you had a coalition government of 4 or 5 parties, if one party withdrew, the whole thing could fall. And Americans used to say, well, that can't happen to us because we have just these 2 parties. And instead, now it's a difficulty. It's even a liability in terms of democracy, because what happens when one party in a bipartisan republic has kind of exited democracy? Not the whole party, but many, and they have supported a violent coup attempt to overthrow the government, even today. And they have coalesced around one individual. And the political science concept I work with in my book is personalist rule. When one man assumes a very outsized importance so that he is able to make loyalty to him a major party canon. And also for his civil service. Loyalty becomes valued over professionalism. And the goals of these people are often not the goals of good governance. They are the goals of amassing power. Sometimes they're the goals of getting rich off of office because they're corrupt. So if one party is kind of hijacked by this person and goes along with it, and then you get a lot of authoritarian dynamics happening, like a lot of lawless people, like the Oath Keepers, the Proud Boys, people going into the party. The party has been transformed in ways that Reagan would not recognize. So what happens, this is when I say it's sad, what happens to people who no longer identify with that party? They don't have anywhere else to go. And nor can you mount a coalition, as happened in Poland, where they got rid of their far-right government. They had a 6-party coalition. So we have a static, somewhat fossilized system right now. And again, it worked really well. But in this particular situation, it's working less well to protect democracy, because those people who have ideals, who are Republicans, don't have anywhere to go. And then I'll just conclude saying that's why it's very important that there's a lot of bipartisan outreach going on. I don't know if you read about this new Republicans for Harris. This is very important. I'm involved in a lot of bipartisan things. I just was a co-chair of an anti-autocracy conference at NYU with Heath Mayo, with Olivia Troy, who was a Trump official, many Republicans, because these people feel that it's time to put country over party. And they also are trying to find a way to protect democracy, and yet no one's really thinking of founding a new party because our system isn't hospitable to third parties. So it's in flux. That could have been the short answer.
Okay, that's good.
I was blathering on. I could have just said it was in flux. But I'm very heartened by all of these initiatives, because it's good for us to be speaking again. It's not good when one side and the other are demonizing each other. That's not good and so we'll see what happens, but it's very much of this moment that this Republicans for Harris has even formed. And the people who are doing it are very brave. They're facing a lot of threats for doing this. And I believe that it's important to support them beyond party. So it's a kind of patriotic thing.
I don't know if this is right, but just my feeling was about a decade ago, there was a rise of authoritarianism globally. There were, even 2-3 years ago, there were election after election after election globally that was, one after another. And it seemed like, for a moment, that we were headed in the same direction, and then things have shifted a little. There's some glimmers of hope globally as well, of anti-authoritarian movements. Can you talk about that?
There is, and it may be difficult for some to see, but I do believe that we are seeing a kind of the start, something that's going to build that's an anti-authoritarian movement globally. Poland is a really big deal, and we can learn lessons from how they did their campaign. Okay, we can't have the six-party coalition, but the messaging of Donald Tusk and Civic Coalition was one of positivity, of joy. They also exposed the corruption of the existing far-right government, which talked about anti-immigrant. It was all about anti-immigrant, and then they uncovered that they had a visa-selling scheme for rich immigrants. So there was they exposed hypocrisy. They did everything right. They had nonviolent protests. We are in a renaissance globally of nonviolent protests. It's very important that it's nonviolent. When it's not nonviolent, you alienate elites who are called pillars of support, who could help you. It's just not a good road to go down. But all over the world, think of Iran, those brave women who came out and bared their heads. Israel has had the biggest protests it's ever had in its entire history. Chile had the biggest protests since the Pinochet dictatorship in 2019. Each place has a slightly different reason, but together there's a collective desire to have more honest, more competent, less unequal society. And in a way, the enthusiasm that we're seeing right now for Kamala, the mass rallies, people dancing, the joy, I think that there was a need for that, and it hadn't been met. It hadn't been met by Joe Biden. It hadn't been met. Trump rallies are they're like a carnival for people. People love going to them. Democrats have not been as good at using emotions, at using rituals, and I think that we're learning lessons from things happening also in France, what happened in France with the new popular front. And I think that we can apply them here. But it's not just here, it's a global thing. And it's very interesting to track. So that's what I'm doing now. I'm tracking where these things are happening all over the world.
We've got about 2 minutes left until we're going to turn it to audience questions, and we're going to have runners on each side with the microphone. You're going to have to speak very clearly into the microphone because this is being live streamed, also recorded, I think. So get your questions ready. My last question for you, though, before I turn it over, is how unique and singular these figures are, and when they're ousted, the imitators or the mini-me's that spring up, we don't ever hear much of those. I mean, I don't think that we can call Berlusconi a mini Mussolini, really.
No.
Not in the way that I'm directly thinking of, like DeSantis or Vance.
So when I go back to the idea of the personalist ruler, who has cult of personality, or you, if you don't like that term, is just very beloved, is a singular, powerful individual, is magnetizing, is an incredible communicator. I try and look at the systems level, the big picture. One of the things that happens is these people spawn imitators. So that's the mini-me. People who aspire to be the kind of man that he is. And they can actually have pretty good careers if they remake themselves in his image. But sometimes what can happen is the strongman he can have too much baggage. This happened with Berlusconi. He had 14 corruption trials, many, many indictments, and some people were like, this is too much. But they are such strong personalities that they don't want to hear about successors, and they don't let anybody else emerge. But in our country, Ron DeSantis was supposed to be a figure who didn't have the baggage. he was cleaner, and so many people coalesced around him. He had like dozens of billionaires funding him. His problem is that he wasn't likable enough on camera. He didn't have any charisma, so it didn't fly, right? So they've been casting about. Now, another example from the Philippines, Duterte. Duterte is a loose cannon, is not even the word for Duterte, right? If you're familiar with the things he used to say that are too profane to repeat here constantly. And so he was too much. And so who came in? Bongbong Marcos, who is the heir of the dictatorship of Ferdinand Marcos, but is not a loose cannon. He's not an imitator because he's in his own dynasty. But this was where the culture was tired of Duterte and all of his blathering and his swearing and talking about doing awful things to people openly. So you have a more disciplined extremist who comes in. And that's what DeSantis was supposed to be, but it didn't take. Now, I'm not sure if Trump thought that Vance was going to be that person. And I wrote a lot about DeSantis, and I have a newsletter, Lucid. Who doesn't have a newsletter today? Everyone has newsletters. I wrote one of the best pieces for me I enjoyed, because I analyzed images, I wrote a book on film propaganda, is that he was trying to create a personality cult on Instagram, DeSantis. But it just didn't work. So Vance, we're living through Vance's waning romance with the media because doesn't seem to be very likable and is making some false steps. So he's not going to be the one. So these are these things that happen when you have an overwhelming personality who influences the way men want to be. And so imitators come up, they last. Their influence is way beyond that of non-strongmen type politicians. And long after they leave, in fact, Trump left office, but he remained the president for many people. That's a very unusual situation in democracy, very unusual. So we've been in a kind of strange transition moment because he's so overwhelming as a personality. So these are dynamics we can learn from, and some of them intersect with the history of autocracy, and some of them are things that we're kind of inventing now as a country, and we're living through them together.
You mentioned your newsletter, Lucid, and you said, who doesn't have a newsletter? Who doesn't have a podcast?
Yes.
All right, we're going to turn it over to you all in the back. Someone will come get you. Way back, all the way.
As a result of your research, did you come to any conclusions as to whether human beings are genetically more disposed to autocracies or democracies?
That's a good question. Genetically, no. I mean, there is this research that a certain part of the population, wherever they are, have attitudes toward things like parenting and other things that could be classified as authoritarian. That's like a nurture or nature. I can't be the one to answer that definitively. But that's why it's very important to study. That's what I want to do in the book. Study what were the circumstances around the world over 100 years when these people appealed. What were the through lines? What were the commonalities? And from doing that, you see that I don't think it's a genetic appeal, it's circumstantial. It's really circumstantial. But we can know the patterns of what those circumstances are, and if we believe in democracy as a superior system, we can address the basic, the underpinnings so that this doesn't happen again as often.
There's the gentleman standing over there. Sorry, I'll look this way next time.
You made an interesting comment that you thought that in part the groundswell that was unexpected behind Trump came from the fact that a lot of people didn't like the fact that we'd had a black president for 8 years. And as I think in terms of some things about the current situation, I wanted to ask you about this incredible groundswell behind Kamala that's happened ever since and is continuing to happen. I mean, people felt that every Jew I know says that they couldn't nominate Josh Shapiro because he's Jewish, and there are all these other issues out there. But is it possible that we've moved past that as a society with all of the intermarriage and all of the pluralism and everything else that's so much a part of our society today? Do you think we're ready to move on to a new level and a new place and away from all of that victimhood and all that anger and all of the things that ended up being a big part of the impetus behind Trump?
I certainly hope we are. And, you know, if you look at the census, and this is what has some people so upset and why great replacement theory is trending, the biggest growing, projected to grow category of people are interracial people. I mean, we are a multiracial, multi-faith democracy. You can see that. I'm a child of immigrants. My mother is from Scotland and my father's from Israel. I was raised with a multi-faith family. You can see that as a blessing. You can see that as a strength. Or you can see that as something that is not good, that has to be corrected. And then we get into the history of purist campaigns, including racial purist campaigns. But I certainly hope that, again, we have learned something from our recent history, and that, you know, what is the price society pays of repressing progress, of repressing certain categories of people? It's awful, and that's the history of autocracy. So I certainly hope we are ready, and it goes beyond politics. It goes beyond politics. I hope we're ready to move beyond the demonization of others because of their faith and their race and everything else.
The gentleman in the second row here on the edge.
Hi. Where would you place Xi in China and Chinese society relative to strongman leadership?
Yeah, China's going through a very interesting period, and one of the things with Xi has been consolidating his power over the last years, and one of the things you can track is the elevation of the personality cult. And as he has cracked down and engaged in disappearances of high-level figures, purges of the party, he has elevated himself so that, you know, instead of the, you know, little red book of Mao, you have Xi Jinping thought. There are new classes. You know, his person has assumed much, much more of an importance. At the same time, he's presenting himself, and so here we have the nostalgia element. The call to the past is not just Chinese tradition, the incredible Chinese civilization. That's kind of always there with Xi. But he's also rehabilitating Mao. He's presenting himself as the heir of Mao, but a Mao that is cleansed of his mass killing. You know, this is what they do. Same with Putin. Putin is putting up, I don't know if you know that Putin is rehabilitating Stalin. He's putting up statues to Stalin. There's a Stalin Studies Center. But what are you not supposed to talk about? You're not supposed to talk about the repression. So Xi is doing a similar thing with Mao because Mao had an overwhelming presence, a personality cult. So that's always interesting to track. But he's leading China into a much more repressive, perhaps imperialist phase of its history. So I'm worried about that.
I'll get to you next. Right there. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. I'm going to dramatically oversimplify your profound comments here to ask my question. If we think about two skill sets to ever be a successful authoritarian, one is incredible communication, sales, con man skills, whatever you want to call it.
Yep.
But the other is somebody has to identify a large enough aggrieved population to appeal to ever get power. The question for you is, how often is it the strong man, him or herself, who actually figures out that need to appeal to and sell to, or is it somebody else who really figures this out and finds the right communication vessel in the authoritarian to get the message across?
That's a good question. You're right. I'm glad you brought up the communication thing, because one of the most interesting, I have a chapter, the book is organized around the tools of rule, and each chapter goes over 100 years. So one chapter is propaganda. And so what came out of that is that these are figures who are able to use the most advanced, whatever the most advanced media technology is at the moment, they master it. So for Mussolini, it was newsreels. For Hitler, it was the radio, because he had his voice, his ranting. Modi, check out Modi's Instagram. You've got to check it out. He's extremely skilled with his Instagram. Trump used Twitter, and the way he used Twitter until he was asked to leave was he would capitalize, because he's a marketer, he's a brilliant marketer, and he would capitalize certain things, and people were like, why is he yelling at us with the caps? He wasn't yelling, he knows that people scroll and the eye sees certain things. Brilliant. So all of them are able to do that. Now the second part of your question, it's super interesting. They are people who have the ability to see forward. Well, they see what's missing in the moment, like I said before. But they also can sometimes see what's coming around the bend. And so they make themselves into the vessel of those unmet needs. Now, sometimes they have enablers who make them the vessel, or appoint them, and here we go to Germany. Conservative elites appointed Hitler thinking they could use him to get rid of the left. And then this has happened over and over again. What happened? Well, it didn't go very well for them, right? And this Mussolini too, he was appointed by a conservative prime minister and the king. And then when that prime minister died, Mussolini didn't even go to his funeral. So it doesn't end well for the people who think they can use the strongmen as their vessel. That's something over 100 years. It's very interesting. I'm glad you asked that.
This gentleman in the second row.
Thank you. I had so many questions. I kind of wanted to whittle it down to my favorite one. But I think that my favorite one was, how do you think authoritarians interact with each other on the global stage? Because it feels like a lot of the way they come to power is through the strong nationalism, and they're sort of fueled by their self-interest. So how do you think, and I hear a lot today, there's sort of a fear of how are autocrats going to interact? Is there going to be a Russia or China or North Korea together? So my curiosity is, how do you think authoritarians interact with each other globally?
Yeah, what a great question. We are living in an extremely, I almost want to say fateful, dynamic age where Russia and China have come together, especially since 2021 around this. Their buzzword is multipolarity, which is a way, part of it is taking down America from being a global power. And the way they interact is super interesting. I wanted to have a chapter in my book called Partners. They're like the worst partners, because these are individuals who are totally transactional, totally amoral, right? So they can ally with each other, but they don't have any loyalty to anyone but themselves. So they're like the worst allies in the world, right? So it's all about things that they're getting from each other. So right now, there are these, Anne Applebaum has a new book, Autocracy, Inc., there are these kind of configurations where they help each other. But it's all about self-interest, right? So just today, the Belarusian dictator, Lukashenko, who's a Putin client, I tweeted about this. He said, I think, because Russia's not in a very good state at the moment, because there was a successful Ukrainian incursion, and he mused out loud that if Putin goes down, then he could be sucked into the funnel. And it was very unusual that he would speak this way. So they watch what each other does very carefully, and the more they're tied together in client-patron relationships, the more they know they could be vulnerable. But they are friends as long as they need to be friends, and then they're enemies. Like Putin and Erdogan, in the space of like a month, they had a big lunch, and they had somebody made plates for the lunch with their faces on them together, like they're best friends, and they walked around like holding hands. Like 2 weeks later, they were almost at war. You know, this is because these are mercurial, self-interested personalities, and so things can change very fast in the strongman world.
We have to leave it at that. I'm sorry.
Thank you all.
The newsletter is called Lucid. Dr. Ruth Ben-Ghiat. Thank you.
Thank you. It's great.